Nietzsche perceived love not as a promise of harmony, but as a silent battlefield. He mistrusted the idea that men and women sought merely connection or tenderness. For him, there was something deeper and darker, a hidden struggle where desire and power intertwine. Love would then be an invisible war, where each gesture of affection might also conceal an attempt at domination. How many times have you believed you were living a sincere surrender, when in reality you were trapped in games of control? What we call passion, perhaps, is nothing more than a duel masked by sweet words and empty promises. Nietzsche doesn't write to protect our feelings, but to expose the wounds we insist on hiding. What if every relationship were, in essence, a battlefield in disguise? If these provocations make sense to you, subscribe to the channel and follow this journey to the darkest heart of human relations. Nietzsche never allowed himself to be seduced by the idea that love was a promise of peace between the sexes. For him, where desire exists, conflict also exists. Love doesn't emerge as a safe refuge, but as a minefield, where every glance, every word, and every gesture carries hidden intentions. To love, in this sense, is not just to surrender, but also to conquer, to dispute space, to mark territory. It's at this point that Nietzsche distances himself from the romantic vision, because he perceives that behind love's vows, there's always a silent war. When two people meet and feel attraction, what seems like an invitation to union is, in fact, the beginning of a struggle. Not an explicit struggle with screams and weapons, but an invisible war, where seduction and power intertwine. Who seduces, dominates. Who allows themselves to be seduced, gives something of themselves, loses ground, yields. How many couples have you seen where affection hides constant dispute, where one tries to control the other's choices, the way they dress, the friends they should keep or abandon? Love becomes thus a war disguised as care. Nietzsche believed that love's language is full of contradictions. When someone says, "You are mine," for example, this phrase sounds romantic, but carries violence within it. It's as if the other were transformed into possession, into object, into conquest. The mine that should be a sign of affection actually reveals the attempt to imprison. For Nietzsche, romantic love, so exalted by tradition, is nothing more than a war pact where each party tries to subjugate the other, even with sweet gestures. If we look at daily life, we can perceive how this manifests. Think of a couple that at first glance seems perfect. They smile in public, embrace each other, exchange affectionate words. But behind the scenes, they argue silently about who has more voice in decisions. One wants to choose the travel destination, the other insists on managing the money. Each decision becomes a veiled battle. Deep down, the relationship isn't sustained only by love, but also by the precarious balance of forces. Nietzsche saw seduction as an art of war. To seduce is not simply to enchant, but to conquer territory within the other's soul. When someone falls in love, it's not uncommon for them to give up themselves, their own habits, their own desires. Suddenly, they begin to act as the other wishes, change their way of thinking, even their way of expressing themselves. This might seem like loving surrender, but in the Nietzschean perspective, it's a sign of the seducer's victory. Whoever wins this battle assumes invisible power over the other. This game of forces doesn't need to be cruel to exist. Many times it disguises itself as care. The man who says, "I only want the best for you," might be, in fact, imposing his own values, molding his partner to what he considers ideal. The woman who insists on correcting the man's behavior often is trying to redesign the other according to her own vision. Each gesture carries within it the tension of who dominates and who allows themselves to be dominated. Nietzsche provokes a painful reflection. Is there love without this war? Or is all love inevitably a duel of forces? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that when we fall in love, we enter a territory where we cease to be only ourselves. The other invades us, transforms us, tears us from solitude. And this process, however beautiful it may be, is nonetheless violent. Because losing oneself, even for love, is always yielding in a battle. The war of love for Nietzsche is not a defect or an error to be corrected. It's the very essence of the relationship. To love is to expose oneself to the danger of losing autonomy. It's to face the tension between wanting to dominate and not being dominated. It's accepting that deep down, passion is never neutral. It's always dispute. And perhaps it's precisely because of this that love is so fascinating and so devastating at the same time. Nietzsche doesn't invite us to reject love, but to see it without illusions. He alerts us, when you love, know that you're entering a battlefield. Each gesture of tenderness might hide a strategy, each silence might be an attack, each promise might be a trap. To love is to risk oneself in the most intimate and silent war that exists, that which happens between two bodies that desire each other, between two souls that want to possess each other and at the same time resist being possessed. Nietzsche believed that behind love dwells a deep and almost savage instinct, the desire for possession. When someone falls in love, they don't desire just to be with the other. They desire to possess them, to have them as if they were part of themselves. This longing doesn't arise from generosity, but from necessity. Love, for Nietzsche, is not pure altruism, but refined egoism. The other is seen as a territory to be conquered, guarded and protected, because their loss would mean one's own ruin. This perspective explains why so many relationships are sustained more by fear of loss than by joy of coexistence. It's not uncommon to see couples who remain together not because they complete each other, but because they fear the emptiness that would come if the other left. Jealousy, in this context, ceases to be just a whim and reveals itself as a form of surveillance, a war strategy. Fear of loss creates barriers, invisible fences, emotional bars, and each becomes guardian of the prison they built for the other. Nietzsche saw in this instinct of possession something inevitable, but also dangerous. Because love, when confused with possession, ceases to be encounter and becomes imprisonment. Think of a man who demands to know where the woman is every hour of the day. He says, "This is care." But in reality, it's surveillance. Or a woman who decides with whom her partner can or cannot relate, justifying her restrictions as protection. These attitudes don't reveal trust, but fear. Fear of losing, fear of being replaced, fear of not being enough. This fear, however, doesn't weaken love. Often it's precisely what feeds it. For Nietzsche, the desire for possession is not an isolated defect, but part of the very dynamic of human wanting. We desire because we fear. We love because we can't stand the idea of losing. Jealousy, in this sense, is a confession of dependence. It reveals how much we need the other to sustain our own identity. If we observe daily life, it's possible to perceive how this logic manifests. A couple, for example, might argue violently because of messages on the phone. Distrust arises from the instinct of possession. The idea that the other doesn't belong to us totally awakens the sensation of threat. Each hidden conversation, each sidelong glance, each small secret can be interpreted as betrayal. It's at this point that love ceases to be a space of freedom and becomes a psychological prison. Nietzsche wouldn't be surprised by this. For him, every relationship carries within it this tension. Whoever loves wants to protect themselves from loss. But the contradiction is inevitable. The more we try to imprison the other, the more we suffocate them. And the more we suffocate, the more we risk losing them. Thus, fear of loss ends up producing what we most try to avoid. The instinct of possession, in its eagerness to guarantee permanence, opens the way to destruction. But Nietzsche didn't describe this war to condemn it. He wanted us to perceive the raw truth. Love is not perfect balance, but permanent conflict, and that obsession with possession is only a reflection of our own fragility. After all, whoever is truly secure in themselves doesn't need to imprison the other to feel whole. The instinct of possession, then, reveals more about our insecurities than about love itself. This is a central point. To love is also to expose oneself to fear. Nobody who loves is protected from loss. Risk is inevitable because the other is free and can always leave. It's precisely this possibility of loss that makes love intense, tragic, and real. If there were no risk, there would be no passion, there would only be comfort. Nietzsche invites us, therefore, to face this truth head-on. To love is to live under the shadow of loss and to accept that there's no guarantee of permanence. The instinct of possession for him is the desperate way we try to fight against this uncertainty. But deep down, it's a lost battle. The other will never be totally ours because they continue being a mystery, an autonomous being, full of desires we don't control. It's at this limit that human drama is born. We want to trap what is by nature free. We want to eternalize what is by essence passing. Nietzsche doesn't offer us consolation before this. He doesn't say that true love conquers fear, nor that trust can dissolve possession. On the contrary, he shows us the harshness of the human condition. To love is to enter a constant struggle between wanting to possess and having to accept loss. Love is war because it involves risk, because there's no surrender without threat, because every embrace brings within it the possibility of abandonment, and perhaps precisely because of this, love is so irresistible. Because it places us face to face with our own vulnerability, forces us to admit how much we need the other, and at the same time, how much we'll never have them entirely. This is the tragedy, and also the beauty. To love is to fight against loss, knowing that sooner or later it will come. Nietzsche never described woman in a simple or obvious way. For him, the feminine was not something that could be reduced to formulas or fixed roles, but an enigmatic, mysterious, and dangerous force. Woman, in his vision, is not merely an object of desire, but an active subject of strategies, a presence that destabilizes man and places him before his own limits. While many thinkers of his era saw the feminine as something lesser or subordinate, Nietzsche saw in it a power of disturbance, a force that disarms certainties and reveals fragilities. It's at this point that tension arises. Man seeks to control woman not just by instinct of possession, but because he fears the enigma she represents. Woman is, for Nietzsche, the great challenge to masculine self-sufficiency. Man who prides himself on his rationality and strength perceives that before the feminine gaze, his certainties become fragile. Woman's mystery disconcerts him, tears him from his position as master, and makes him experience the sensation of being before something he'll never be able to completely decipher. This mystery doesn't mean passivity. On the contrary, Nietzsche suggests that woman exercises her power precisely in subtlety, in the capacity to not surrender entirely, to remain always a little inaccessible. The enigma is her most powerful weapon. Man can conquer territories, riches, social positions, but when he encounters the feminine, he finds a battlefield he cannot dominate with brute force. He finds himself entangled in seduction games, in silent gestures, in half-words that confuse him. Think of a couple where the man believes he's the center, the one who makes the big decisions. However, it's the woman who, through small gestures, determines the relationship's course. A word said at the right moment, a silence loaded with meaning, a look that exposes the other's fragility. This invisible power is what Nietzsche identifies as the enigmatic force of the feminine. She doesn't need to impose herself directly. It's enough to remain being an enigma for man to find himself obligated to revolve around her. Nietzsche perceived that this game is not superficial. The feminine enigma confronts man with his deepest fear, the fear of not being enough. Man seeks to assert himself, prove his worth, conquer, but woman, in her silent presence, shows that he'll never have guarantees. No matter how much he tries to trap, possess, dominate, there will always remain a space that cannot be controlled, a zone of mystery that escapes. This space is what keeps the tension alive. It's what transforms love into an endless struggle. In daily life, this manifests in subtle ways. How many men don't feel insecure before a partner who maintains her independence? How many aren't bothered by the fact that woman has secrets, thoughts, or desires she doesn't completely share? This sensation of not possessing totally is seen as threat, when in reality, it's just the expression of freedom. Nietzsche saw in this phenomenon the root of many conflicts. Man fears what he cannot dominate, and the feminine is the embodiment of this impossible to control. But Nietzsche didn't condemn woman for this. He recognized that this enigma was her greatness. If man tries to reduce woman to an object of possession, it's because he cannot bear her alterity, the fact that she is a radical other, unattainable. The feminine, in this sense, is not weakness, but strength. It's the presence that reminds man of his limitation, that tears him from the illusion of being sovereign. This vision deconstructs the idea that love is balance. For Nietzsche, there's no perfect harmony between man and woman. There is, yes, permanent tension, game of forces, silent war. And at the center of this war is the feminine enigma, which keeps man restless, desiring and vulnerable. It's precisely because of this that love doesn't stabilize. It moves between the desire to dominate and the impossibility of reducing the other to something controllable. Nietzsche, therefore, doesn't romanticize woman, but also doesn't reduce her. He places her as the great challenge, the force that destabilizes and reveals the truth about man. Before her, he needs to confront his own insecurity, his eagerness for control, his fear of loss. The feminine as enigma cannot be solved, only lived, and it's this impossibility of capture that keeps alive the flame of passion. Thus, love is not the tranquil fusion between masculine and feminine, but the tense coexistence between power and mystery. Man tries to dominate, woman resists with enigma, and from this clash is born intensity, pain, and beauty of love. Nietzsche invites us to face this truth without illusions. To love is to confront the enigma, accept that we never possess totally, recognize that the invisible war between men and women is inevitable. If in the feminine Nietzsche saw enigma and subtle force, in the masculine he saw the weight of the mask and hidden fragility. Man for Nietzsche is not the absolute master that patriarchal society exalted, but a being in constant struggle with himself, trying to sustain an image of power that, in reality, rests on deep fears. Behind the figure that presents itself as dominator, there exists an abyss of insecurity and helplessness. Man constructs himself on the necessity of appearing strong. From early on, he learns that he cannot show vulnerability, that he must be the one who provides, protects, and controls. This role becomes armor, but also a prison, because deep down, man feels the weight of not being able to fail, of not being able to reveal his fragilities, of having to carry the burden of authority even when exhausted. Nietzsche perceived that, in this tension, man doesn't actually dominate. He merely interprets a role, and his strength is often just performance. This performance becomes even more evident in love relationships. Before woman, man fears losing control, fears that his fragility will be exposed. That's why he insists on showing himself firm, decided, secure. But a silence, a refusal, an absence of affection is enough for the abyss to reveal itself. Jealousy, rage, and even violence can arise not as expression of real power, but as response to fear of crumbling. It's as if man, facing the risk of being rejected, saw his own identity collapse. In daily life, we see this paradox in many examples. The husband who demands respect from his wife but silently fears no longer being desired. The father who imposes rigid rules on his children but feels the anguish of not knowing if he's failing. The young man who flaunts love conquests but hides his insecurity before the possibility of not being truly loved. Each gesture of strength might be, in reality, an attempt to hide emptiness. Nietzsche understood that this emptiness is not individual defect, but human condition. Man lives before the abyss because he knows, deep down, that he doesn't control life, that he doesn't control death, that he doesn't even control the feelings of the woman he loves. The effort to show himself as master is, in reality, a desperate attempt to deny his impotence before existence is chaos. Thus, the masculine figure reveals itself not as sovereignty, but as constant struggle, not to fall into the vertigo of nothingness. That's why love becomes so dangerous for man. He doesn't just desire woman, he needs her as confirmation of his own worth. If she desires him, he feels strong. If she rejects him, he crumbles. This dependence exposes the fragility of the mask. The masculine, which presents itself as conqueror, depends on feminine recognition to sustain its own image. Without this, the abyss opens under his feet. Nietzsche didn't describe this dynamic to ridicule man, but to show the depth of human tragedy. Man is not an absolute tyrant, but a vulnerable being who dresses in power not to face his fear. The invisible war between men and women doesn't reduce to masculine domination, but to the encounter between two fragilities, that of man, who fears losing control, and that of woman, who resists through her enigma. This vision leads us to reflect how many men live imprisoned by the necessity of being strong. How many cannot admit their insecurities because they were taught to hide them. This prison doesn't liberate, it only corrodes silently. The man who never cries, who never asks for help, who never shows weakness, is a man who lives constantly before the abyss without courage to face it. Nietzsche proposes, indirectly, that true masculine strength is not in dominating, but in accepting one's own vulnerability. Recognizing that we're not absolute masters, that love exposes us, that the other deconstructs us, is the first step to facing the abyss without masks. This doesn't mean abandoning the struggle, but struggling consciously, knowing that strength is not in hiding fear, but in walking despite it. Thus, the masculine before the abyss is not just a tragic figure, it's also the chance for transformation. Instead of hiding behind the illusion of control, man can learn to look inward, to confront his own ghosts. The abyss doesn't disappear, but can be faced with courage. And perhaps, by recognizing his fragility, man discovers he doesn't need to dominate the feminine, but just accept that the enigma will always remain. Nietzsche doesn't leave us comfortable. He tears us from the illusion that harmony exists between the sexes, but it's precisely in this discomfort that he invites us to grow. The masculine before the abyss is the portrait of all of us, who pretend control when in reality we're always on the verge of falling. And perhaps true strength lies not in denying the abyss, but in daring to remain before it without fleeing. If love for Nietzsche is a war, then its soldiers don't wield swords or shields, but words, silences, gestures, and glances. The battle between men and women isn't fought only in moments of open conflict, but especially in the most subtle layers of coexistence. What seems like care might be control. What sounds like affection might be emotional blackmail. What emerges as tenderness might carry the seed of manipulation. And it's precisely in this invisible terrain that love's war shows itself most intense. Nietzsche saw love as a game of forces, and every game implies strategy. Men and women, when relating, don't act only moved by spontaneous passion, but also by hidden desires to influence, mold, and guide the other. Manipulation in this sense is not accident. It's an inevitable part of human love. To love is also to try to guide, even if disguisedly, the other's course closer to our desires. This becomes visible in simple situations of daily life. Think of someone who constantly praises certain attitudes of their partner, but falls silent when they act differently. Silence, more than praise, functions as signal. I don't want this from you. Gradually, the partner learns to adjust, to repeat only what receives approval. Love, which should be space of freedom, converts into training field, where one molds the other without needing to order anything directly. Another example, emotional blackmail. How many times does someone say, "If you truly loved me, you'd do this for me"? This phrase, apparently innocent, is not just a request for affection, but an attempt to impose conditions on love. Nietzsche wouldn't be surprised by this type of gesture. For him, love is not innocent, but loaded with intentions. To love is also to want the other to serve us, confirm us, sustain us. Manipulation emerges as a silent weapon to guarantee this confirmation. And however, manipulation doesn't happen only consciously. Many times men and women manipulate without realizing. It's as if love awakened by itself, a kind of strategic instinct. A man who shows himself fragile in excess might be, without wanting, seeking to awaken in the other the sensation of care and dependence. A woman who distances herself and shows herself inaccessible might be creating, even if unconsciously, an atmosphere of mystery to increase desire. In both cases, the relationship moves between attraction and power, between surrender and control. Nietzsche saw in this a confirmation of his tragic vision of life. For him, there's no pure love, transparent, totally free of second intentions. Where there's passion, there's dispute. Where there's affection, there's also calculation. This doesn't mean love is false or always cruel, but that it's inevitably ambiguous, carrying both sweetness and shadow. The invisible game of manipulation is, in reality, an essential part of what makes love so fascinating. In it, we never know if we're being loved for who we are or for what we represent to the other. The drama intensifies because often manipulation is reciprocal. Each party tries in its way to mold and be molded. It's like a dance where roles alternate. Now one leads, now the other resists, now both intertwine in subtle strategies. This dance keeps alive the tension that Nietzsche so much highlighted. Love, far from being stability, is constant movement, war without truce, game without final winner. However, Nietzsche doesn't describe this scenario to lead us to despair, but to tear us from illusions. Love's problem is not manipulation itself, but the blindness of those who believe they're living something totally pure and innocent. It's this naivety that makes us easy prey. By recognizing the invisible game, we can face the relationship with more consciousness, knowing that every gesture carries intention and that every intention reveals, somehow, a desire for power. This awakening, however, doesn't eliminate conflict. We continue to manipulate and be manipulated because this is human dynamics. What changes is how we choose to live this. We can delude ourselves and call it destiny, or we can accept the war and walk with more lucidity. Nietzsche invites us precisely to this second posture. Not deny manipulation, but unmask it. To love is dangerous because it exposes our fragilities, but also because it shows us how far we're willing to go to conquer and maintain the other. Thus, love ceases to be just a promise of happiness and reveals itself as a strategic game of effective survival. Men and women face each other, not with visible weapons, but with smiles, sweet words, calculated silences, and unexpected tears. Each tries in their way to guide the other, and it's in this web of invisible manipulations that love is built, sustained, and often destroyed. Nietzsche forces us to face this truth without masks. To love is also to manipulate, and to be loved is also to be manipulated. There's no possible innocence. Love is a duel of intentions, an invisible game where nobody leaves intact. And perhaps it's precisely because of this that we continue to throw ourselves into it, even knowing the risk, because in manipulation, in struggle and in pain, we also find the intensity that tears us from routine and makes us feel alive. After traveling through the territory of seduction as battle, of instinct of possession, of feminine enigma, of masculine fragility, and of the invisible game of manipulation, the question remains, is there any way out? Nietzsche didn't believe in romantic solutions or promises of harmony. For him, love is not something to be purified of its conflicts, but something that must be faced in its tragic essence. Love, like life itself, is struggle, is pain, is contradiction. And precisely because of this, it's also beauty, intensity, and creation. Nietzsche saw in love a reflection of what he understood as fundamental condition of existence. To live is to affirm life, even in its cruelty, even in its paradoxes. Thus, to love is not to seek security or perfect fusion, but to accept the risk of loss, the inevitability of conflict, and the constant presence of pain. Love is not a fairy tale, but a Greek tragedy. Intense characters, overwhelming passions, inevitable falls, and still we return to the stage time after time, because it's in this tragedy that we find what's most human in us. Tragic love is not desperate love, but lucid love. It knows there will never be total possession, that the other's enigma will never be deciphered, that manipulation will always be present, that fear of loss will never disappear. And still, it chooses to live. This is the central point. To live love without illusions, but also without cowardice. To accept that war is not defect, but essence. Love is tragic, because it places us face to face with our greatest vulnerabilities and at the same time makes us experience the intensity that gives flavor to existence. In daily life, this can be translated into something very simple. Stop expecting perfection. How many relationships destroy themselves because someone believed love should be pure, free of conflicts, eternal and stable? Nietzsche invites us to distrust these promises. Love is not stable, it's tension. It's not pure, it's mixture of desire and power. It's not eternal, it's always threatened by loss. But this doesn't mean it's empty. On the contrary, it's precisely because it's fragile, uncertain, and dangerous that it's so valuable. Imagine a couple that lives believing there should never be conflict. They avoid discussions, hide feelings, pretend harmony. With time, this denial suffocates because real life doesn't fit into masks of perfection. Now think of another couple that recognizes their tensions, that admits power games, that faces jealousy, that deals with the pain of not possessing the other totally. This couple, although living in conflict, is closer to Nietzschean truth. They don't hide from war, they accept it as part of love. Tragic love doesn't ask for resignation, but courage. Courage to love knowing the other can leave. Courage to desire even knowing there will never be total possession. Courage to enter a battlefield and still call this life. Nietzsche didn't want us to flee from pain, but to transform it into strength. Love then ceases to be promise of comfort and becomes exercise of greatness, to bear tragedy and still affirm yes to life. In this sense, to love tragically is perhaps the most authentic way to love, not because it eliminates war, but because it integrates it. Love ceases to be seen as salvation and comes to be understood as struggle that's worth it. It's war, but it's a war that tears us from boredom, that exposes us to risk, that teaches us about ourselves. It's pain, but a pain that shows us how much we can bear. It's loss, but a loss that reminds us of the preciousness of what we have. Nietzsche knew this vision doesn't comfort, but transforms. Tragic love invites us to mature, to abandon childish illusions, and to face reality with open eyes. It's accepting that there will never be definitive peace between men and women, but that it's precisely in this conflict that what's most intense in life reveals itself. Love is not escape from the world, it's diving into it. It's not promise of paradise, it's affirmation of tragedy. To love, in the end, is to accept chaos. It's saying yes to risk, to pain, to mystery. It's walking between wounds and beauties, knowing that no victory is definitive, that no possession is eternal, that no embrace lasts forever. But still, it's choosing to live all this. Because, as Nietzsche taught us, life only becomes great when we have the courage to embrace tragedy without fleeing from it. What we learn in this journey is that love, in Nietzsche's vision, is not peace nor harmony. It's war, it's manipulation, it's mystery, it's fragility. But it's also intensity, courage, and tragedy lived with lucidity. Recognizing this doesn't mean giving up on love, but accepting it in its truest form, as a battlefield where there are no guarantees, but where everything pulses in a living and authentic way. And now I ask you, what belief about love has imprisoned you the most until today? Share your reflection in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. If this journey made sense, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and help this philosophical community grow. Thank you for being here, walking with us in the dark and fascinating territory that Nietzsche invites us to explore.